Thank you so much, Leanne, and thank you everyone for being here. I'm going to talk about Hotbed, this book, and I hope that this interested crew will learn something and it's new about Greenwich Village. So the book tells two entwined stories of this place, of Greenwich Village, and of the people and ideas that animated it in the second decade of the 20th century, specifically the women who were active politically and socially, really at the heart of that scene. And my title and my way of approaching this story really places the emphasis on that germination and cross-pollination of ideas that happened in this incredibly fertile place and time. And so at the center of the book is a club called Heterodoxy, which some people may have heard of, but I hope those of you who haven't will be eager to learn more. As my title puts it, it's a secret club that was a women-only organization. It was founded in 1912 and ran in somewhat different formats for around 25 years. Long outlasting most of the other rival political and social discussion groups that started around the same time in the village. Over that time, this women's group, which comprised about 100 members over the course of its existence, became more of a social group with some professional networking, I think, built in. But in its first decade, which my book focuses on, it was a place for women to gather who were fired by the urgency of transforming the world around them by claiming rights and righting wrongs. A few distinctive features of the club before I get into some of the individuals who were part of it. It was a group that emphasized, its name, Heterodoxy, emphasized difference. It really wanted to be a place where people of differing opinions, differing backgrounds could come together. And to some extent, that was reflected in its membership. There were a range of ages in the club, the youngest members in their early 20s and the oldest in their late 50s when it started. And they came from different backgrounds. The majority were educated and middle class, but by no means all. They had different political beliefs, sexual orientations, even religions and races, which is pretty unusual even for the Bohemian Village at this time. The club met every other week and members paid dues and they organized their meetings in advance, but they did not take notes. This was part of the ethos of the club to make sure that everyone who came to the meetings could speak freely, that disagreements could happen. And because many of their members were very prominent at the time, they didn't want to necessarily have those opinions and debates and disagreements recorded for posterity. Of course, this has made it very difficult for historians to research the club, and as I think contributed to its neglect as a historical group and as a really important place where feminist ideas were first made public and made popular in the United States. And the other part of the club that I really focus on in the book is the network and the friendships among the women who made it up. Even without notes, many of the women who were writers themselves wrote about it in memoirs, and there is correspondence and evidence, really a wealth of evidence as to the importance of the bonds that were formed in the club. And I think part of that is because these were, by and large, very progressive women and very unusual women in the larger context of their time. One small illustration of that, this was a time when the divorce rate in the United States was hovering around 2%. The women in the club, fully 1/3 of them had been divorced at least once, several of them more than once. And that sense of notoriety of being ahead and outside of your time is difficult, and helped, I believe, by the strength of community that was formed in the club and between these women. The other, so before I get back to the club and its individuals, we'll talk a little bit about the context of Greenwich Village at the time, which I think this group is familiar with, but I'll try to talk about how it specifically helped the club form and function. This is a painting by one of the club members, Ida Proper. It's a painting, it's a watercolor of Washington Square and of Washington Square Park. And of course, I want to sort of use it as a backdrop to talk about some of the distinctions that made Greenwich Village so important and so fertile in the early 20th century, so in the 1910s. This was a time when it was hard to access as a neighborhood, had its own meandering street geography, and its borders, the borders of what was known to a certain number of its inhabitants as the village, those borders were always in flux and somewhat under debate, which is a feature of New York neighborhoods, has always been. One member of Heterodoxy, the journalist and novelist Mary Heaton Vorse, wrote that under scientific scrutiny, it is an indefinite area below 14th Street, winding around a variety of irregular streets, while John Reed, a journalist, friend, and lover of several Heterodoxy women, placed it in his 1912 poem, The Day in Bohemia, twixt Broadway and 6th Avenue, and west perhaps a block or two, from 3rd Street up and 9th Street down, between 5th Avenue and the town. So it was a dense, small neighborhood where mixtures of people and classes was inevitable, not only possible, but you couldn't really avoid mixing with people who were different from you. And Washington Square Park, illustrated here, was really emblematic of that mixing, that social mixing. The wealth on the north side, the Henry James Washington Square, and then on the south and east side, small factories like the notorious Triangle Shirtwaist Factory, apartments, rooming houses, which were home to many immigrants and poorer factory workers, labor organizers, cheek by jowl with these social reformers, college graduates, aspiring poets like John Reed, and many of the Heterodoxy women. The village writer Juna Barnes, who was a friend and associate of Heterodoxy, described Washington Square Park as satin and motor cars on this side, squalor and push carts on that. Mary Heaton Vorse was optimistic about how these classes could come together, claiming one group of people melts gradually into another group or is superimposed on it until one has that intangible thing called atmosphere, poor abused word. And atmosphere was something that very quickly became marketed and sought after, not only by villagers themselves, but by people who were observing this American Bohemia. These photographs were taken by Jessie Tarbox Beals, who is the woman pictured on the right, standing on the right in the white dress on my book cover. She was an artist and photographer and moved to the village starting in 1917, took photographs of the neighborhood that she used to promote it. And also she turned them into postcards and sold them. And she was one of the many, especially women who were sort of interested and invested in the commercialization of the neighborhood, and helped to make it somewhere that tourists started to visit, especially by the end of the decade. On the left here, you can see Patchen Place, where Juna Barnes lived, as well as John Reed and with his wife, Louise Bryant, a friend and guest of Heterodoxy. That not great quality photograph at the top right is one of the incarnations of Polly's restaurant, and below it is Grace Godwin's garret, and you can see Grace Godwin, one of the many female business owners who ran these restaurants and cafes in the area, dishing up a bowl of spaghetti to a casually dressed crowd of men and women. So and this sort of quintessentially Bohemian kind of hangout, this is really the atmosphere of the village that Mary Heaton Vorse is talking about, and the atmosphere that visitors and journalists were always trying to capture. Starting in about 1915, there's a wealth of articles that you can find with, we dispatched our reporter to find out what the Bohemians are really up to, and they're always sort of typically kind of reporting back saying, nobody was saying anything particularly shocking, and we had to go on to another place, and we kept hoping that somebody would, some revolutionary something would break out, and it was always not there. It was always we missed it. It was last night, or the really good party was somewhere else. So this narrative of Bohemia as both available to outsiders, but also constantly elusive, is, I think, something very characteristic of the village at this time, and that only becomes more so as it gets mythologized in the memories of those who were there. This woman is one of the, she doesn't look terribly Bohemian here, but this is Marie Jenny Howe, who was the founder of Heterodoxy, who arrived in Greenwich Village, arrived in New York in 1910, and eventually, before too long, found her way to the village. She's an unlikely sort of candidate in some ways for starting a club like Heterodoxy. She trained as a Unitarian minister. She was from upstate New York, born into a politically progressive family near Syracuse. And she met her future husband while she was studying to be a minister. He proposed to her and she turned him down more than once. And then when she qualified, when she was given a post as a minister, she was sent to Iowa, where many women ministers were sent sort of far away from the church's centers of power. She found it a frustrating experience, despite making good friends among those other women. And around the turn of the century, around 1899, she read Charlotte Perkins Gilman's best-selling book, Women and Economics, which was a absolutely transformative book about, for this generation of women, of feminists, explaining the connections between women's rights and women's roles in society and socialist thinking, and the need to transform society from the bottom up if women were ever to achieve genuine equality with men. So she wrote essentially a fan letter to Charlotte Perkins Gilman, told her that she had sort of revolutionized her thinking. And before too long, she left the church. She did end up marrying her original suitor, Frederick Howe, who was a Democratic operative and progressive reformer. They lived for a while in St. Louis and then moved to New York, where she invited Charlotte Perkins Gilman to join Heterodoxy when it began. She was somebody who was renowned as having a genius for friendship. She was a suffrage organizer and seems to have been someone who almost effortlessly was able to rally people to causes and bring them along. So gathering this group around her was the beginning. This poster shows you the sort of first foray of feminism, of heterodoxy women in doing their work to popularize feminism, the idea that brought the club together to a wider audience. In addition, these are two public meetings that were held at Cooper Union in 1914. You can see from the list of names that there are men and women involved, at least in the first meeting. Almost everyone on this list, almost all of these speakers are heterodoxy members or their husbands or partners. It was really very much a heterodoxy production. In addition to these events, heterodoxy women also published articles, and often with a title like "What is Feminism?" which really illustrates how new this set of ideas was and how much people wanted to define it and figure out what it encompassed, how it was different from suffrage, and how it was different from the other movements for women's rights that had been going on for decades. What's interesting to me is that the first of these meetings is about personal experience. It really highlights what feminism means to me, for men and women to speak about that their own personal definition. And it's not until the second meeting where we start talking about rights. And those rights are not the right to vote. I think that's taken as a given. The rights are much more broadly encompassing: the right to work, the right to her name, which is the right to keep her name on marriage, which was an important principle for heterodoxy women, and the right to ignore fashion, which I like. This was an era of a lot of there's a lot of debate around how women should dress, and the trying to get rid of the corset and adopt more freeing clothing. Part of Bohemia's mythology is its the sort of flowing robes and the unencumbered artistic dress that the women would adopt. And I'm going to show you certainly one of these women you can see in that kind of very Bohemian kind of dress on the right. These two women are sisters-in-law. They were both early and eager members of heterodoxy. On the left is Crystal Eastman, and on the right is Ida Ra, who married Crystal's younger brother, Max Eastman. I could have chosen any number of heterodoxy women to sort of show you, to introduce you to the idea of really the mix of causes and the overlapping sense of political and creative and personal change that feminism meant to these women. And both of these women were law school graduates. Crystal Eastman and her brothers were born in upstate New York. Their mother was a Unitarian minister. And Ida Ra is one of the few Jewish women in heterodoxy. She was from a secular, wealthy Jewish family on the Upper East Side. They were both, they met in law school. They were roommates for a while, and they had a lot of intersecting interests. And their friendship and their sort of network is really emblematic of this larger, the way in which heterodoxy was both a kind of formally organized club and a group of like-minded women coming together out of friendship and the pleasure of each other's company as much as anything. I said both of them were law school graduates. They both went to NYU Law, one of the few law schools that accepted women, but neither of them was able to find a job practicing law. Ida didn't need to financially, Crystal did. Crystal found her way into social work and settlement house work. And as part of her social work, she became very involved in the documenting of labor violations and the impact of worker accidents on the lives of families, accidents being a huge part of the lives of industrial workers at this time. And both of them, in fact, were part of organizations to help improve factory safety and fight for workers' rights. Crystal went on to focus on civil liberties, and she's probably best remembered today as one of the co-founders of the ACLU. Ida, in addition to her political activities, she was a big birth control activist, was also a very talented actress, spoken of as one of the best actresses in the avant-garde Provincetown Players, which was very much a heterodoxy effort in the later part of the decade. Both of them also illustrate in their personal lives the challenge of feminism when it came face to face with children. Both of them married and both of them had children. Ida's marriage to Max Eastman broke up when their son was very young. Max, who had proclaimed himself on Marie Jenny Howe's stage and in print elsewhere in many ways as a feminist, was unable really to shake the idea that that his wife should be the one to preoccupy herself with the baby, that she should know and want to be the primary caregiver. And when she said that was not what she wanted, he didn't stick around. They broke up when their son was 5, and he didn't see his son again until he was an adult. So it's really when babies arrive, the challenge of feminism for men seems to have been, for these men in particular, seems to have really been insurmountable, at least in terms of reconciling those very rigid ideas of one's upbringing with this attempt to make a new form of family and relationships. In the political sphere, I wanted to focus on 2 women in heterodoxy who were really prominent in the socialist movement and the labor organizing movement, and are really 2 of the women whose presence in heterodoxy somewhat confounds the idea that it was a middle-class gathering. These are both women who were working class and whose involvement with social activism was extremely committed and public and ongoing. On the right, in her speaking pose, is Elizabeth Gurley Flynn, and on the bottom in her writing pose, these are both kind of photographs for public consumption, is Rose Pastor Stokes. Elizabeth Gurley Flynn was an Irish working class girl who grew up in the Bronx, dropped out of high school to become an organizer with the industrial workers of the world, who were getting started around that time as really a new idea of how a union and union activism could work. They rejected all attempt to divide workers based on who was skilled or unskilled or based on race, which other labor organizations really did. And they wanted to bring together the workers kind of collectively in the class struggle, in an international struggle. And for Elizabeth, for Flynn, she's interesting because she said herself that she was suspicious of friendship and working political activism with middle-class women. She thought that she had far more in common with working class men than she did with middle-class women. But heterodoxy, she said, has been an experience of unbroken delight to me. She called it a charmed circle of friendship among women. And in return, she brought some of heterodoxy's feminist consciousness to her organizing with the IWW. Rose Pastor Stokes had her own extremely headline-grabbing story. She is a Jewish immigrant who worked in a cigar factory, and through her work in the settlement house movement, managed to meet and then later married Graham Phelps Stokes, who was the youngest son of a very wealthy WASP family. Their marriage was absolutely, kind of a tabloid sensation. She was one of several women who were dubbed the East Side Cinderella at this time. And she used her wealth, but both she and her husband were committed socialists for this time. And Rose became sort of notorious and famous as a very talented speaker. Both of them were apparently extremely charismatic speakers and organizers. And again, both Rose and they were close friends. After Elizabeth had a baby, she went to Rose's country estate to recuperate for several months. They were both women who wanted to make sure that the socialists did not overlook or downplay the specific needs of working class women in their organizing and their activism. Later in the decade, when World War I introduced a huge amount of surveillance and espionage directed at primarily left-wing activists in the US, both of them were followed, surveilled, reported on, and both later became, and Elizabeth Gurley Flynn started to devote herself to the legal defense of other working class activists who were being arrested in their thousands in this period. They both later arrested themselves, spent time in jail. Both of them became communists. That's beyond the scope of this book. But there are biographies of both of them, which are fascinating, and they're really extraordinary women. I wanted to talk about them first because I think in this period it's easy to think about feminism as being primarily focused on suffrage, on the fight for the vote, which was certainly, as I've suggested, something that all of the women in heterodoxy were committed to, but which most of them saw as something, sort of the first step, really elementary in the fight for women's rights and social justice. Nevertheless, they were very visible in that movement. Several heterodoxy members were very visible. This cartoon, I think, is an interesting one to give some context to what the suffrage fight looked like in the 1910s, in the decade leading up to the 19th Amendment. This is a cartoon by Boardman Robinson, who was a left-wing artist whose wife was in the club. The type has changed, is the caption, and it really illustrates on the left your traditional frumpy, dour female women's rights activist who does not look like she is interested in being celebrated, and she's not interested in seducing anyone into seeing her point of view. The woman on the right, the sort of Gibson girl with her suffrage ribbon, is eminently fashionable, eminently stylish, and essentially this cartoon is pointing to the change in the public perception of suffragists at this time, and also in the change in suffrage tactics. Many of the organizers, as newspaper reporting and photography became much more visible and easy to access, as sort of fashion became something that people could see in print, many of the suffrage organizers realized that they had an asset here, that if beautiful women were being photographed, why not beautiful women who could be suffrage figureheads? And step forward, Inez Milholland, one of heterodoxy's youngest members, also a NYU law school graduate, a former girlfriend of Max Eastman's, and a friend who was also a roommate of Ida's and Crystal's for a while. She was a Vassar graduate, and from about 1910 onwards was a reliable headline grabber. She was both beautiful and outspoken and rich, and that was a sort of irresistible combination to newspaper editors who wanted to get a good quote and a good picture. Here she is preparing to to lead the procession for suffrage in 1913 in Washington, D.C. She took part in many of these tableaus and public events where sort of dressing in classical garb or otherwise representing a sort of symbolic ideal of womanhood, but a sort of progressive version of it. This was very much sort of what she was known for. But she, like Crystal and Ida, and like her other heterodoxy friends, had a range of interests, wrote and sort of lobbied for other causes, the labor movement especially. Her father was one of the founders of the NAACP, and she was also very active in the NAACP's work in the early 1910s. But she became more committed to suffrage as 1916 and the 1916 election approached, which for Alice Paul of the National Women's Party seemed like crunch time, seemed like the time to really push President Wilson to make good on his sort of mealy-mouthed commitment to women's suffrage. Her tactic for that was to rally women who could vote in the Western states in support of Wilson's opponent. This was a very controversial tactic, but one that she pursued pretty single-mindedly. And part of her approach was to put Inez Mulholland on the road on a grueling speaking tour through the West. She was taking trains kind of extraordinary distances in a very compressed amount of time, giving speeches until November of 1916, when she was in Los Angeles and collapsed during her speech. She was hospitalized, but she never recovered. October of 1916. She was hospitalized for several weeks, but never recovered. And so she was 30 when she died and became a martyr for the cause. She was a figurehead who really became kind of her image, and her purported last words became kind of a rallying cry. Mr. President, how long must we wait for liberty? This picture gives you a slightly different idea of how the suffrage movement operated. This is a picture from 1917, the year after Inez Mulholland died. Doris Stevens and Alison Turnbull Hopkins on the left and the center here were heterodoxy members. Doris Stevens was the political director of the National Women's Party, and they were a big part of the campaign that started in early 1917 to take up take the protest to President Wilson's gates physically by this protest known as the Silent Sentinels, where they where suffrage activists would stand outside the White House and simply be present in an attempt to remind and sort of illustrate to Wilson and to other politicians and to everyone passing by that their silence was something that had been enforced, that the government was enforcing. When the war broke out, when the US entered the war, this became a much more controversial and much more reviled practice, and many of the women were imprisoned. This only kind of increased the pressure on Wilson, but still did not quite push suffrage over the finish line. One of the things that becomes very clear, from Doris Stevens's book, Jailed for Freedom, which came out in 1920 and tells the story of this campaign, is just how frustrating it was for these women to have got to the point where many states had granted suffrage to women, and there was a general sense that everyone was politically agreed that this was something that was going to happen, but no senators seemed to really take it seriously as a priority. No one was interested in pushing it through, and so these kinds of tactics grew increasingly. There's a certain desperation that comes from them to push this through, which finally happened thanks to a sort of concerted effort among the different suffrage groups in 1920. One other member of heterodoxy I would like to introduce you to and talk about is a woman who I mentioned the NAACP before, and she is connected with that organization. Every history of heterodoxy will note that there was one Black member, but says very little about her. And I was fascinated to find out how she got involved in the organization, and what that relationship with the white club members was like. So this is Grace Snail Johnson. She was a wealthy Black New Yorker. Her father ran a successful restaurant. She grew up in Brooklyn. And in 1911, she married James Weldon Johnson, who was already a very, very prominent figure as a civil rights activist, but also as a poet, as a journalist, and as the composer with his brother of Lift Every Voice and Sing, which was adopted by the NAACP as the Negro National Anthem. Grace and Grace's brother, this is that wonderful photograph in the center of her with her brother's, her brother's new motor car was taken in 1915 in Harlem. Her brother Jack was a big real estate developer, instrumental in helping Harlem become really an epicenter of Black cultural life in the 1920s. Grace and James Nail Johnson lived there for years, and so they were not part of the Greenwich Village scene and not physically present. And Greenwich Village at that time, the Bohemian enclave, was not a mixed race enclave. It was still rare for Black people to be living or socializing in the village. And several of those Bohemian establishments were officially or not off limits to Black patrons. So how did Grace become a part of heterodoxy? I wondered. And that was able to actually find the letter in her archive at Yale, which is Marie Jenny Howe's invitation to join, or sort of command to join the group. You were today elected to heterodoxy with real enthusiasm, she writes, as many of them know you. So do be a good girl and come regularly and be responsive. Heterodoxy is the center of more real friendliness among women than any groups I know. This is its chief recommendation. So it's a complicated kind of letter, I think. It's interesting that Grace's, this is 1918, so a few years after the group had been formed and it was running. Grace is known, Grace and James Nail Johnson were known to some of the activists in the club already. And the idea that she is sort of elected to come seems to have been, clearly there was a debate, a discussion about whether or not to invite her. And Marie's teasing, but also patronizing tone in inviting her, instructing her to come and be a good girl and come and be responsive is uncomfortable to read and hard to pass, really. How she was considerably older than Grace, and she was also seems to have been to have a sort of maternal and somewhat joking approach in her other letters. So this doesn't seem entirely out of character, but nevertheless, it is a little fraught given the context. But the important part about Grace's interactions and presence in heterodoxy, I think, is that she seems to have been very much an active member of the group. And there are letters from other heterodoxy members that attest to an ongoing friendship. There are attempts to offer her support, offer support. She became in the early 20s more involved with the NAACP's work against lynching, and there was a sense of deference from the other heterodoxy women to her role, to that work, but also a keen interest, and she was encouraged to invite both her husband and her brother to be guest speakers at what were known as husbands' evenings that heterodoxy hosted. And her, and she, there's also, evidence. I found a whole series of letters of thanks for Christmas gifts that she had given to Marie. And so there's clearly a social and a sort of an overlapping political, shared political aims, but also some real friendship that is evident there and is rare in organizing and rare in social life in New York City at this time across different races. And so the final, then I want to take a final turn to show you both another member of Heterodoxy, but more importantly, this album. So several of the images that I've showed you have came from the primary document that we have of evidence of who was in Heterodoxy and how they thought about it. The album was called Heterodoxy to Marie. It's a hand-bound collection of photographs and inscriptions that seems to have been assembled in 1920. I think that is probably for Marie's 50th birthday, which would have been that year. And it's a great record of who was in the club, but it also has these wonderful glimpses of insight into what the club meant more broadly. And I want to end on Catherine Anthony's page. Catherine Anthony was a biographer of women. She wrote feminist and sort of psychologically attuned portraits of feminist sort of great women from history, everyone from Catherine the Great to Margaret Fuller to Susan B. Anthony. And she was the partner of Elizabeth Irwin, the founder of the Little Red Schoolhouse here in Greenwich Village, and a keen education advocate. She writes in her dedication to Marie is affectionately dedicated this portrayal of the evolution of a butterfly into a chrysalis, which is a lovely encapsulation, I think, of what, for many heterodoxy women, the journey to feminism and into a feminist life really looked like. On the top there, we have the most, the traditional debutante portrait of a beautiful young woman who has been primped and corseted into a gown that looks like a bridal gown, readying her on the cusp of her adulthood for the one purpose that she has been bred for and led to expect. The chrysalis below is a woman working at her desk with her bookshelf behind her, reading and engaged in the work that would define her life. And this idea of the butterfly, leaving behind the decorative butterfly for this hard-shelled chrysalis that could become anything, I think is a real, a really beautiful just moment in this book. This wonderful album. This is in the Schlesinger Library's collection at Harvard, but it's fully digitized. So if you're interested in heterodoxy, you can flick through the pages. You can look up all of the people who are part of the group, see their photographs. And I will say that as a researcher writing about a group this large, you do hope for some easily dismissed, kind of not terribly interesting people. That doesn't happen with heterodoxy. Everyone that I hadn't heard of, I would Google and hope just this one person is maybe has an obscure career, but I would keep finding this is, actresses, artists, poets, activists, political leaders, university professors. These women had extraordinary lives. A handful of them have biographies, but by no means enough. And so this book is my attempt to bring them to notice and hopefully give them a little more attention and more visibility for historians and those who are just curious about New York and history. So thank you so much, and I'd love to hear questions and thoughts.
Great. Great. I hope everyone can hear me now. I have a different audio situation going on. So, Joanna, that is fantastic. And I'm just reminded of so many conversations that I've had recently about women's rights in general that we didn't necessarily think we'd be having right now. And I think this is a good way to kind of delve back into our history. So feel free to put in your questions. I have a couple questions for you, Joanna, that have come in already. So first question, with women, you talked about women's last names. Someone asked, what happened when they got married? Did it just automatically change? Was this different from other countries? Do you have any other information about that kind of process at the time?
Yeah, it was fascinating. There's several of the women, Ida Ra, who I mentioned, who married Max Eastman, made headlines when she said she was keeping her name. There was a newspaper article written, the headline was "A Miss, Though Married." And the idea was, the journalist, the whole thing is sort of taken from the position of just astonishment that a woman would not use her married name, and kind of what did that mean? Did that mean they were really married? She actually says in that article quite revealingly that she'd actually rather not have gotten married at all, but it was impossible to kind of work together and live together with the man she loved and not have the scandal get in the way of the work that they wanted to do in the world. So that was a really sort of revealing comment. But Max says in that, I didn't want to, I think it's assume or subsume my wife's identity in mine. I mean, practically speaking, it wasn't really, it was sort of automatic, but it also didn't really, a woman had so few rights on marriage. It's not like she could get famously a credit card, a loan, any kind of, she couldn't really operate in the world under her own name. So there is an argument that it was largely symbolic. So these women said they didn't want to adopt their husband's name, but it was, officially, it was pretty much automatic. And then some of the women in heterodoxy in the 1920s, it becomes more of a campaign. And I think one of the, Ruth Pickering, who is one of the members of heterodoxy, I believe was the first woman to get a passport and in her own name rather than her husband's name. So that was something that they were sort of fighting for. But yes, it was certainly rare enough to be worth a full newspaper article.
That's fascinating, especially for me. My last name is G. Bowley because my mother kept her maiden name. And even in the 80s, I had kids come up to me and tell me my parents weren't married because my mother had a different last name. So
that's fascinating.
Yeah, so I'm very into that kind of history and learning more about that. Someone asked the question at Patchen, or the photo at Patchen Place. Who was the couple in the photo? Do you remember who that was? And you can share your screen again if you need to go back.
Who was in the photograph?
Mm-hmm.
I'm not sure. Let me see let me share. Nope. Hold on. God, I've lost the screen share thing. Oh, there we go.
Yeah, I turned off the
screen that's
share.
okay.
Sorry, I should have waited till after we did this.
Yeah. So let me go back to who's there on the side? I'm not sure if they've been identified reliably. I'm honestly, I'm not sure. I don't think they're identified in a caption. It's possible that historians have, there are possibilities out there, but I don't think Jessie Tarbox Beals captioned them or left a definitive record of who they are. But you can see what the woman is wearing, which is very interesting, sort of loose, this kind of loose smock of an outfit that's a very sort of typically Bohemian, typically Greenwich Village outfit. So that's something she's clearly of the neighborhood, even if we're not entirely sure exactly who she is.
Definitely. I loved talking about Louise Bryant at Patchen Place this weekend at our walking tour, and my mother reminded me that Reds is about Jack and Louise. which I saw when it was on a double VHS tape. So if someone wants to go back, I don't know how historically accurate that movie is, but
well, Reds is fascinating because Reds interviews a lot of the, the way he intersperses the talking heads with the action, and I believe Elizabeth Gurley Flynn is one of the talking heads in that. I think she lived to be, after she got out of jail, but she lived to be fairly elderly. So I think she might be one of the talking heads. There's definitely people in that, in the talking head section who are associated with heterodoxy. It's been a while since I watched it. I have to look up again, but it's one of those. That movie was late 79, I think, something like that. And history it's close enough to touch even then. It's really, really fascinating how it can feel very distant, and then it can feel like last week.
Definitely. Yeah, no, it was just so funny because I was talking about Louise Bryant and that it was on the tour, and my mom's like, Reds, and I was like, oh my gosh, I didn't even connect the two. And I don't know if you have information on this. Village Preservation might, but I would have to do some research. Do you know what the impetus was to remove the benches from Washington Square Park for that period, and who decided that, or?
I don't know.
I think we'll have to dig into our archives and see if there's any information on that ourselves. But.
Yeah.
And then there was a lot of commentary from folks about the use of girl, the word girl, in the letter to.
Yeah, I mean it's pretty. I mean, yes, be a good girl. It really kind of sticks and trips you up. But it's certainly, I mean, this is a period when grown women were called girls all the time. Like it's really, especially, it's extraordinary kind of how, much that was just a common term. You're reading newspaper articles about these like suffrage activists, and you would come across girl a lot. So it's certainly belittling, but I'm not sure. I think that there's as much affection as there is patronizing anything. I mean, Murray and James Nail Johnson were close friends, and the letters sort of attest to a lot of, they socialized together. She writes about feeling bad because he's had her over for dinner and she hasn't reciprocated, so she can't go again until they, this kind of back and forth. And they, so they were working together. They were part of a group. I think in 1916 they attempted to start a political group in New York City that was an interracial organization. There was James Weldon Johnson was part of it. Du Bois was a part of it, and Marie Jenny Howe and her husband. And they were. It was a kind of a political, like a localized, taking up sort of local political causes. People who were dismissed from jobs for racist reasons, so they were trying to do some kind of, instead of on the national scale, sort of address these local issues. It's got a very generic name, something like the city organization, or like, it's so generic that it was difficult to research, and it was kind of fleeting. So I don't know how long it lasted, but it was, there were these moments of cooperation, but it's hard to sort of find, it's against a backdrop of such extreme segregation and just kind of a sense of separation of worlds, and it's challenging to kind of get back and see how those how people are different or not different from the kind of prevailing attitudes of their time.
Yeah, it's fascinating, and I can't imagine the historians who are looking at our times have the historical record of Facebook and Twitter and Instagram to go back to, and who's gonna be sitting in a whatever the webinar version is in 2095. what they'll be saying about what we said. And then one last question, someone asked, when did the club disband or close?
Sort of hard to identify exactly. It certainly seems to have stopped being active by the late 30s. Marie Jenny Howe died in 1934, I think. And actually, I believe James Weldon Johnson spoke at her funeral as just a little moment of that friendship was a genuine one, and a long-lasting one. And after her death, I think the club, it was harder for it to sort of sustain itself. But there's evidence in the mid to late 30s of club members sort of supporting each other financially and kind of helping to helping with like those friends who needed work, needed money, needed political support. So it was pretty much done by about 1938, 39, I think. But again, I wonder if there were possibly some unofficial meetings that maybe continued, or certain friends continued to meet. By that point, you really had, the women who had been in it from the start were, this is 20, 25 years of friendship, and perhaps possibly people just didn't really feel they needed the club anymore. And I think there's this question of like, do we bring in younger people, or do we just kind of keep our group, our friendship group, and commiserate about our aches and pains and things like that, rather than kind of, because the politics, I think, really, sort of changed and moved on. And some of the people in the club continued to be very active politically, and others of them simply didn't, and just kind of found sort of professional careers that they sort of retired into, or they just sort of left that kind of world behind, left the city, and it was harder to do. I think also people just weren't in the same part of what kept it going was people in the village, and the village changed. The village became a harder place for, it became a more expensive place to live. And I think the political kind of energy of the teens dissipated a lot. And I think it took a bit of the club spirit with it.
That's fascinating. And just the parallels with what we're going through, a century later, it's still the teens and the 20s. And I know most people I know are moving to LA or somewhere else. So how that disrupts the activism of now is very interesting too. Well, lots of praise coming in. I put the link to the book in the chat. I hope you all check it out. You can purchase it. And Joanna, thank you so much for this evening. It was really fascinating. Great for Women's History Month, but great for any time.
Wonderful.
For us to kind of discover.
Thank you so much. Thank you everyone for coming and giving up your Monday. And yeah, really happy to talk about this group and these women anytime.
Definitely going to be part of my cocktail conversation, I know, for the coming months. Yes. At least. So.
The highest honor.
Definitely. Thank you all. And as I hit leave, we'll all disappear at once. So have a great afternoon, and we'll follow up with some links and things in an email. Thank you so much.
Thank you.